why did you hop on the phone with me within 24 hours? It's just so odd. And he basically said, well, it was mostly because of your performance at Square. And I was like, well, what do you mean? You weren't on the Android engineering team, you didn't see anything. He was like, no, but I did see that, at the office, you would come in and you'd wear these literally, short shorts that were even shorter than these that I'm wearing today, tank top, you would be super loud, you'd be climbing on the air ducts, doing pull-ups on them in the middle of the work day.
Yeah.
And he was like, despite that, and Square being an office that is extremely particular, right? Design-led, these designers will complain if the smoothies in the morning are too thick basically. And the complaint and the COO, I get all of the complaints from smoothies to personnel, etc. And he was like, the behavior that you're exhibiting almost certainly should have come up with behavior complaints that I would have seen, and yet nobody complained about you. And so the conclusion that I made was man, this guy must be a really good engineer if everybody on his team is willing to tolerate the fact that he's barefoot, tank tops, doing pull-ups, etc. And so I should just take the phone call because you're a very quirky and very talented engineer.
Delian, thanks for coming on the pod, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us to record out of the Founders Fund office.
Welcome to paradise.
Yeah, no, this is pretty sweet. Beautiful. Amazing view. Yeah. So your family arrived to the U.S. with a couple $100. Then you interned at Square. You did a bunch of things in between. Now you're a partner of Founders Fund and started a space manufacturing company. Tell us that story.
My parents basically managed to immigrate to the United States, away from the sort of post-Soviet Union collapse Bulgaria, which definitely had, a lot of, issues at the time. And a part of why they were able to is they both basically got into, originally my father into Caltech and then my mother basically a year later, 2 years later. Basically arrived, I think epitome of American dream in some ways, literally arrived with $100 in their pocket. Yeah. And early on, my mom is now a professor basically in what I call behavioral economics effectively. It's got a lot of psychology in it, but also, economics. And part of the reason why she got interested is because there were these basically advertisements up on campus where if you basically went and participated in these behavioral economics experiments that basically were almost trading experiments. They basically set up these artificial markets and they would introduce news about, inflation or some company's earnings report or something like that, and basically studied how people reacted to that in actual trading environments where if you traded the best out of the class, you actually got the real cash. Yeah. And so my parents started going because they were like, we need a way to make cash on the side in the evenings. What's a better evening job than using our mathematics and statistics skills to try and game these markets and become really good traders basically. Yeah. And through that, my mom got fascinated and ended up basically going to go study under that professor and ultimately ended up making that her whole career. Yeah. So anyways, it was fun, growing up as a kid, basically on, Caltech's campus, basically surrounded, by academics. We ended up moving to Utah.
Were you born here in the States or
born in Bulgaria?
Okay,
gotcha. So I was basically, there until 3.5. It was funny actually, the summer after so basically came here for I think preschool effectively, then went back for the summer and then came back for kindergarten. I remember coming back into the classroom and literally just realizing oh shit, I definitely learned English last year, but I cannot speak it anymore because I was back for 3 months in Bulgaria and completely forgot it. Yeah. And of course you're young and so picks back up again very quickly, but very much was a sort of outsider.
And you guys moved straight to California?
Yeah, basically.
Why California?
My parents were grad students at Caltech. So
okay, that was the connection.
Yeah, Pasadena, effectively. Okay, right. So that was where I grew up, and I was just surrounded by just the wonders of true academia in some ways. I always had this life path. I got fascinated with aerospace early on. Caltech, of course, has JPL, and so I was always thinking okay, I'll do an undergrad and something math, computer science, engineering, and then come to grad school at Caltech, and then go work at JPL and do something in robotics, deep space, something like that was sort of the default path, especially because when we then moved to Utah for my middle school, my mom was a professor, or still is a professor at the University of Utah, which was the impetus of basically moving there. And again, continued to be surrounded by academics. If you asked 7th, 8th grade Delian, he basically thought everybody had a PhD and everybody was a professor because that was everybody that I knew in the adult world. But I think started to come to the realization once I got into college that maybe academia was not the best place for impacting the world of aerospace, and ended up taking a hard left turn. let's see, moved to Utah for middle school. Ended up getting pretty deeply involved in a lot of basically like robotics, math, computer science projects. Did math competitions since a very early age, and did pretty well at those. In 10th grade, basically started. There's this like high school robotics competition called First Robotics, and so I started or helped start. The first robotics team at my high school. I also took a bunch of basically like university classes while I was in high school. So the University of Utah, most people don't appreciate, but it's actually like in like the top 10 of like computer science departments.
Interesting.
If you actually look early on of like the DARPA intranet on the West Coast is basically like UCLA connecting to Stanford, connecting to University of Utah, and then East Coast was like Harvard, MIT, and then I forget.
Is that in Salt Lake?
Yeah, in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, nice.
They had some of the best like early computer graphics like departments. So it actually still has like if you want to be like a game designer, University of Utah, specifically in that type of software engineering, is actually like top 2 basically.
Amazing.
And so like EA Sports, all the basically big video game companies, all have like massive offices downtown in Salt Lake. So anyways, I started like taking all these sort of computer science classes on the side. Got my first like software engineering internship like between the summer between 9th and 10th grade, and then I did another one about 2 summers later. And so pretty early on, just started to realize like I was picking up things more quickly maybe than I thought, and also was like starting to get into the world of sort of real world development of software and products, etc., rather than just like the pure academic version of it. And so by the time I like landed at MIT, it's like I'd already been basically like a professional software engineer. I'd already taken all like the freshman and sophomore year equivalent courses at a very good school, the University of Utah, and already knew at that point I was like I want to do something in aerospace, and I want to do it via robotics, software, etc. And so had a pretty at the time I thought clear path of like, okay, great, I'm still going to do this like undergrad at MIT, grad school at Caltech, get to JPL, but like do it very quickly, ideally graduate from MIT in like 2 years or something like that. But anyway, that's a maybe brief summary of childhood. I could dive into any particular areas.
Yeah. So speed seems like a theme throughout like your career, your childhood. You've been saying like
John Coogan said like you speed run Silicon Valley. I think one of his videos. It's hilarious.
I mean, it's probably more from less of a focus on speed and more of like impatience, I guess. And, maybe high energy level.
Yeah. So what was that pivot from academic track to saying, hey, I want to start a company, do Nightingale, that whole split?
Yeah, it's funny. I always think of life, for me, at least had like, sort of 2 major pivots. The first one was in 10th grade. I basically had this realization. So my dad, phenomenal mathematician. He, in high school, was on the Bulgarian national math team and went and competed at the International Mathematics Olympiad, got a gold medal there. Awesome. And in 10th grade, I basically had this realization where I was pretty damn good at math, for sure, whatever, like, top 0.1%, in the United States. But in order to get a gold medal at like the mathematics Olympiad, you basically have to be like top 0.001, percent. And I was not quite at that level. And I met those types of people, and I could tell I had like a different brain than they did. Like, it is very impressive to meet those types of people. And so my first pivot was, okay, I want to go do something that I can be like top 0.001% at. It's not going to be mathematics, but I'm pretty damn good at computer science. I like the world of like software applying to the world of hardware. What better place basically than to basically start this robotics team? And so first pivot was like, screw math, let's go into like robots, space, etc., and like make that basically the thing, since I think I can be like top 0.01% on that. So that was like sort of first major pivot, and then second major pivot was it was definitely not at one particular moment, but pretty rapidly at MIT, I started to realize like 2 things. First was I did have this interest in entrepreneurship in the world of startups. I got somewhat lucky in that I had this friend of mine, Romy Kadri, who literally like I think my second week at MIT like literally stopped me in the elevator and said like, hey, I've heard about you, high energy, etc. Do you want to good at computer science? Do you want to come join for these like weekly dinners that I do with the business school, where we basically bring together like undergrads, business school students, and we just like talk about the local Boston startup ecosystem. They have speakers come in, etc. And I was like, free dinner, why not? It's going to be way better than what I get in the cafeteria. So basically started going to those and started getting pretty hooked on the idea of like, man, like, maybe this is a world that I want to, go into and like, intern, at a startup. And so that was probably like the first seed of it. Actually, I ended up like working on my like very first like proto startup that I very rarely talk about with this guy, Romy Kadri. It was sort of supposed to be like a data-driven touring manager effectively. We would basically like analyze like YouTube, Facebook, internet traffic, et cetera. And this is like, this is in fall 2011, spring 2012, right? So it was like early days of like Google Analytics and stuff like that. but we would basically, take artists and then use that to actually like determine like their tour schedules. He had actually worked at like a top tier, basically like artist management company that, gosh, I should know the name of, but it's been now long enough that I can't quite remember the name. But they manage like, they're like definitely like the top three, manage tons of major artists. And he'd been there as an intern the prior summer, and he basically realized he was like, all the touring managers would just completely guess. So that was like the first step into it. And like spring of freshman year, I literally like in the midst of like exam season was like flying out to like go to our first like sort of data-driven tour, basically stage that we had set up. And show that we had set up, and so was clearly hooked on the idea. Realized that spring that we were probably not quite going to become sort of massive startup, et cetera.
Yes.
So sort of decided to stop working on it, and then got lucky in that. I'd always wanted that freshman summer to go into the world of Silicon Valley, go work in an interesting startup. At the time, I was by far the most fascinated with Jack Dorsey, and so literally got pretty lucky in the Square interview process in that both they weren't typically considering sort of freshmen as internships, and then two, even when they like flew me out and interviewed me, they originally actually like passed on me as an intern. Basically, I had not impressed a couple of the engineers in terms of like my SQL query like ability, which I thought was like very stupid, in that I clearly was a very good engineer, just like hadn't written that many complex SQL queries, but got lucky in that I really made a strong impression on the CTO of Square, Bob Lee, RIP. He unfortunately passed away earlier this year. But he made a really good impression on him, and he was really willing to sort of take the bet on me, and so he actually reversed the recruiting team and the engineering team's decision on passing on me, and basically said I could come be his like personal intern.
How big is Square at the time?
At the time when I interviewed, it was probably like 60, 70 people, and by the time I got there, it was maybe like 110, 120. And it had grown enough, and Bob Lee started to take on more like, let's say, like non-pure engineering responsibilities that once I got there, he was like, look, I'm probably not going to be that interesting of a mentor because like I'm mostly working on like not engineering projects. Go choose your sort of favorite team. And so I spent like probably 3 hours with the hardware team, and I was like, oh my god, these like projects, like it is low-level firmware, and I do like software plus hardware, but like everything that we're working on is like, at the time, this would have been like summer 2012, I was like, everything we're working on is like 2015 shipment dates. I'm not going to be around for that. I want to ship, I want to work on something that we can like ship in the 3 months. And so I was like, well, what else am I good at other than like firmware? I've developed a decent amount of Android apps, and the Android team here is like the world-class Android team. Basically, like the like founders of Android, a decent chunk of them basically had left Google and come to work at Square, and so you had this just like literally like probably the best Android team by far anywhere in the world, basically. And so I was like, I want to go, work for those guys, and so I managed to finagle my way in, even though they were originally like full on interns, basically. I managed to finagle my way in, and that was just that summer was just like a complete blast. Like, you just like go from reading about Silicon Valley to like was like living in Alamo Square, $1,000 a month rent, like living in a bunk bed in like a hacker house type thing, biking to work every day, and just like such a cool commute because like even on the bike in, you're like going down Alamo Square, going through like Hayes Valley, way before like Hayes Valley became what it is today, through Soma, you like see Uber, Square, all these like cool startups along the way. We were in the old like San Francisco Chronicle building, so it was just like this beautiful building. And then like I got to like see Jack give his like corporate presentations, and Keith Boy at the time being COO, and like watch the company go from literally like when I like interviewed was like 80, by the time I joined it was like 120, and I think by the time we left it was like 300 or something like that. Just like
over the summer,
like starting over the summer. They were literally like, I mean, it was something like 10, 15 people basically like starting a week. They were just like really in this rapid sort of scale up mode. Like the Android team when I joined, we were like maybe like 4 people, 5 people. And by the time I left, we were like 13 or 14. And so when I left for like the internship, people had assumed I was a full-timer because they were just like, he's been here, he's like shipping code, he's like more senior than the rest of us in terms of time here. And then like, I don't know, even like got to do like a one-on-one with Jack Dorsey like back in the day. That impact on me.
That's awesome.
Back in the day when like, a lonely, or a lowly intern was allowed to ask for a one-on-one.
And that's where you met Keith Boy as well, right? So what was that process of, because then you were his chief of staff years later, right?
Yeah. So I didn't actually meet him during the internship, one-on-one or anything like that. Obviously, knew his name and watched his presentations. He knew of my name, basically, given that at 120 people, you kind of know everybody's like name, but didn't necessarily, ever, chat. He made a really strong impression on me. Basically, it was like I want to say it was like August 10th, 2012, roughly around then. basically it was like the first week effectively where Square just like hadn't experienced like consistent week over week growth basically since the company had launched. Because for a long time the company just had this like magical organic growth engine that actually took them a little while to figure out. But it was basically like when you actually like had merchants with a plugged in Square, people would basically like physically see the merchant take your card via this like Square headphone jack thing, and then they would get hooked, and like 1 out of every 100 customers would actually also be a small business owner that could use Square. And so you had this like very natural, basically like, super
my wife did
organic.
that.
The K factor was literally like, 1.15 or whatever every single day, and people would just like consistently sign up. And so, August 2012, the company's now been launched for about 2 years. It had been growing super consistently, and then now all of a sudden, for the very first time, it's not growing, and everybody's panicking because it's like, has our golden goose somehow stopped, laying eggs? Has the fountain of youth basically, shut off? What has happened? Keith went and did this like, really in-depth analysis that at the time, I have to admit, I was obviously an unsophisticated, 18-year-old. Yeah, I was 18. Relatively unsophisticated 18-year-old that did not know that much about statistical analysis of companies, and so he produced and presented what I now know as like a cohort analysis. But at the time I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. He basically showed like, look, we do have this like magical K factor that introduces these like net new cohorts that are always like basically slightly larger than the prior one because we now have more and more merchant base that is making it so that we just keep growing more and more. There's like a larger base for that K factor. However, despite the fact that that's normally been able to outweigh any seasonal factors, in the United States, in August, there is actually just less local, merchant volume because people are on vacation, people travel, etc. And so the local cafe just makes less money. And so we're now just large enough for the first time where the seasonality of the base actually outweighs the growth that you can get, even though the base is larger from that K factor. And so he like basically perfectly predicted. He's like, look, by 3rd or 4th week of August, we'll actually see like growth return. It'll actually basically catch up because there will be a bunch of merchants that had seen it out and on the go while they're on vacation or whatever. And when they come back, they'll basically like sign up for it. And lo and behold, obviously 3rd week of August, everything came back and it was ripping. And I just remember seeing that moment because like my dad is a statistician. I remember just like seeing this moment of like, whoa, you can apply like mathematics and like statistics and like logic to the world of business and actually use that to like influences the decisions that people make. I just remember thinking, I was like, I had no idea, you know what I mean? Like anytime you're watching movies, you never see like, you see it in like trading world, but I was not interested in like, that world, but I never thought in like company building that like statistics had applications basically. And so it was very fascinated by that. He made a really strong impression on me there. And so, didn't talk to him or anything for a while until basically after leaving Square, basically was like, I want to come back to Silicon Valley ASAP. I happened to have roomed basically in that like hacker house with a guy that was friends with the Thiel fellows. They brought me to a couple of Thiel fellowship basically events, and so started to think, okay, this is maybe my way back to Silicon Valley, but rather than just being as a software engineer, let me basically go build something. And so basically winter of my sophomore year, applied for the Thiel fellowship, and then as a part of that application process, basically reached out to Keith off a cold email, basically saying, hey, would you be willing to chat with me and give me some advice on this like Thiel fellowship? I know that you know Peter, and give me some advice on my startup, and would love to like meet, because he basically transitioned from Square to being a venture capitalist, basically roughly that same winter. And I was like, hey, since you're now a venture capitalist, would you be willing to give me advice as a founder? And sort of funny story. 3 or 4 years later, after I got to know him, I was the chief of staff, etc. I'd then seen how he responds to various cold emails, because he basically from the cold email basically was willing to hop on the phone with me basically like 24 hours later. And I asked him a couple of years later, I was like, hey, normally when like a random intern sends you a cold email, you like never hop on the phone 24 hours later. Like your response rate probably is only like 50% or 25%, and then even then you're normally scheduling them like a week or two out. Like, why did you hop on the phone with me within like 24 hours? It's just so odd. And he basically said, well, it was mostly because of your performance at Square. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Like, you weren't on the Android engineering team, you didn't see anything. And he was like, no, but I did see that, at the office, you would come in and you'd wear these like literally, short shorts that were even shorter than these that I'm wearing today, like, tank top. You would like be super loud. You'd be like climbing on like the like, air ducts, doing like pull-ups on them in the middle of like the work day. And he was like, despite that, and Square being an office that is extremely particular, right? Design-led, these like designers will complain if like the smoothies in the morning are like too thick basically, and the complaint and the COO, I get all of the complaints from like smoothies to personnel, etc. And he was like, the behavior that you're exhibiting almost certainly should have come up with like behavior complaints that I would have seen, and yet nobody complained about you. And so the conclusion that I made was like, man, this guy must be a really good engineer if everybody on his team is willing to tolerate the fact that he's like barefoot, like tank tops, doing pull-ups, etc. Like and so I should just take the phone call because like you're a very quirky and very talented engineer.
That's hilarious. That's very interesting. So what's the gap between when you send the email to, or rather when he remembers you at Square to when you send the cold email? It's like a year, maybe
7 months, maybe something like that. I left Square probably third week of August, and I would guess probably like Feb 1st the following year, roughly when I sent it. I think I've tweeted that email somewhere. It'd be fun to pull it back up.
Yeah, that's interesting. So is this like an interesting transition where you grow up in this math-heavy home, to say the least, and then all of a sudden you are in a space where math goes from abstract applications to you can use it to invest, you can use it to build companies, you can use it to build software, you can use it to all these things. Is that kind of an accurate read of what you were thinking at the time as you're entering Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I mean, all this stuff, it's like easier to, paint it retrospectively, obviously as a 19-year-old, that's sophisticated to, present that framework. But yeah, generally say I was interested in the application, of my engineering and mathematics skill set. And when I look at, my, venture career today, if there's one thing that I've really learned from Keith is just like the fundamental question you should ask whenever you're making any investment is just like, why are you going to be the investor that appreciates the most? And basically in the sort of second order effect of that question is why won't other people basically appreciate it as much, right? And I have a multitude of answers for that. Sometimes it'll be like, hey, this is a company that is based in Eastern Europe because of my Bulgarian background, I'll appreciate it. But if you look at the commonality of the majority of the investments that I've made, one of the core ones is I can appreciate this because in order to understand it, you need to have a core engineering and mathematics background, but also be able to understand how that will apply and not get lost in an academic sort of problem. And so when I think about where I tried to lean into on my career, it's sort of the overlap between those two. It's just background in mathematics and engineering, but also understanding how does that actually apply to the real world and where does it have effect? Given that if you get too stuck on either end, it's very easy to basically find people that work on these super academic ideas that will never have business applications. Right. And then obviously there's plenty of investors that can understand business but have no clue how to underwrite mathematics or engineering.
Yeah.
I heard you say somewhere that the Raboy chief of staff position was 10 years of experience packed into 2. So now that you've done Varda and you've had more experience as a founder on top of that, looking back, what are the things that stand out to you that you learned from Raboy that then you've applied later?
Yeah, I mean, I'd still say it's still the segment in my life that I've had the biggest step change in growth, learning, and opportunity. I'm pretty skeptical I'll ever experience that type of step change ever again, honestly, because the next step change is so high that it's probably impossible to do in a short period of time. It'll take decades to sort of hit. I think it was just an extremely unique opportunity for whatever I was, 23, 24 at the time, to get from going from being a first-time failed founder to working at Teespring for a year or so, and getting to see a larger company and having a let's say a bit more executive authority there and larger projects, to all of a sudden going from that to the day-to-day, tactical tasks that the role involved were not that interesting or strategic. You don't necessarily learn a lot from that. The chief of staff is mostly air traffic control in some ways, is how I describe it. But the exposure that you get in terms of I got to sit in on Max Levchin running his Affirm board meetings, and not just once, but for years on end. So I could watch how the company was problem solving, how Max was communicating to his executive team, to his investors, and not only that, but then also Max was probably one of the very few where I didn't get to actually whenever Max and Keith would do their one-on-ones, I wasn't allowed to be in those just because it's sometimes a little awkward professionally to bring in a chief of staff into a relationship that you've had for obviously 25 years. But let's say for other founders, they were still very high quality. Keith would bring me in for this one-on-one, so it's not only the board meeting, but also the one-on-one with their closest confidant, mentor, etc. How he was helping them problem solve, and it's just over the course of 2 years, you encounter everything. lawsuits where the company is getting sued, acquisition channel that totally shuts off, regulatory action, that again results in lawsuit, fundraising that totally fails, fundraising that has 15, offers from every single startup or every single investment firm and everything basically in between, executive hiring, executive firing. I mean, it's just and you're getting to experience this across 25 different companies over the course of 2 years. And so that's why I describe it decades of experience where it's I literally got to watch 25 different companies basically go through 2 years of challenges in an extremely intimate level that you don't get if you're a reporter interviewing them. If you're even an IC employee working at these companies, you don't get the level of exposure that you get from being basically in the room and shadowing the lead investor that is the prime confidant and mentor basically of the founder.
Certainly don't get that on an MBA.
Yeah, definitely don't get that in an MBA. Case studies pale in comparison to being in the boardroom basically.
Yeah.
If I were to point out basically the biggest couple of lessons that I think have applied to let's say my time at Varda, the first is probably sort of Keith's philosophy around company building, which the analogy that he likes to use that I really enjoy is the best startups look more like filmmaking than they do A/B testing. In that let's take something like Top Gun, right? When they're writing the script and they're thinking about the actors, it's not like they go to audiences and say, hey, should we have Tom Hanks as the fighter jet pilot or should we have Tom Cruise? He's no, I love Tom Hanks, he's great in the Apollo film, things like that, but it's not the fighter jet pilot, right? That's not, he's not the badass doing the stunts, doing the crazy things. It's obviously Tom Cruise.
Right.
So they write the script, they cast the perfect character for each individual position that is most appropriate. They understand how they're all going to complement one another, and you don't go preview it or do an MVP or anything like that. No, you go fund and you build the whole film. You might make a trailer that is a component of the whole film to use it as marketing material, but you're not A/B testing your way to the startup. You know the script, you know the people, you know exactly what you're going to do, and then you go do the damn thing. And so his example of this is in Open Door. If you look at it, the four co-founders, Ian Wong, Eric Wu, Keith Red Bull, and JD Ross. Keith obviously knew all of them for a decent amount of time, but basically the rest of the co-founders had effectively never met, but he basically cast each of them individually for their exact skill set, what they brought to the table, and basically how it related to the basically sort of top four basically core risks of the company, and each of them was basically world-class in helping de-risk that very particular sort of risk. And so when it came to Varda, I basically just applied that exact same framework to how I thought through the company. I was what are the core risks of the company, and what would the archetype, what would that actor look like that would basically perfectly fit into that role, that would basically de-risk that risk as much as possible, and basically then went and hunted down people that sort of matched that profile. So that I would say is probably the most impactful lesson from that time. The rest are all around just let's say everything from storytelling and how important that is both to raising capital, but then also attracting talent, attracting customers, attracting attention sort of when appropriate, and then some amount of just the tactics and incentives of Silicon Valley. There's one thing to know, here's the list of the top 20 venture capital firms to raise from. There's another thing to know, here are the team dynamics internally, here's how large they are, here's how they make decisions, here's what their LP base looks like, here's how they report, here's where they are in their fund cycle, right? Just much more deeply understanding the rules of the rules and incentives of sort of Silicon Valley, both from LP to investor to GPs to founders to executives to individual employees, and understanding just all layers of that stack, because through exposure from him, you got to basically watch all layers of that stack and really, really deeply understand them. Those are probably the two biggest areas.
So we're at Varda now. I heard you say also in another podcast, I think it was with Jason, talking about how you had the idea for Varda for, I think it was 10 years, but certain things weren't lining up to make it possible for you to actually build it. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd always been fascinated with just the industrialization of space, and that thought that the only way for humanity to truly become multiplanetary was not just exploration, but you ultimately needed economic incentives and economic means in order to have humanity out there. And it was just clear that obviously industrialization was going to be that economic incentive. It's not going to be tourism or exploration, et cetera. Those come after you basically have sort of industrial incentive, and manufacturing in orbit, and lunar ice mining and asteroid mining. Those being the population of ideas that I was interested in. in 2011-12 when I was doing the Thiel fellowship. I definitely did like explorations on nights and weekends. Hey, should I like instead of building a company, should I like go be an engineer at SpaceX? Should I go work at some of the first generation, let's say, industrial space companies? Groups like Made in Space, Deep Space Industries, Lunar Express, probably being like the top three basically at the time. Definitely debated basically working at all three of those, but at the time partially came to the conclusion. One, I don't know that I want to be like an individual contributor engineer either at SpaceX or some of these other companies, and that I'll build up a great resume and experience. But again, I was more interested in like merging the world of business plus engineering rather than just being an engineer alone. And then two, it did just feel like those first generation of industrial space companies. It was just like wrong time, right? Access to space was still super expensive. These things felt more like academic R&D projects, and they did like something that could commercialize quite quickly. And so ultimately ended up sort of shelving the idea for a while. Still would study. I watched every single press release. I would like try to meet the founders whenever sort of I could. But ultimately didn't act on the idea. And then the next time it really popped into my head again was probably like late 2017 or so. Basically, I've been tracking SpaceX for a long time, and it was very clear to me that if you looked at basically like their mass orbit. Since 2009, it basically followed a perfect exponential equation. You definitely had like some blips around some of the rockets failing, but in 2017 to me it felt obvious if you extrapolate this out for another 3, 4, 5 years, these business models really start to do make sense. And so December of that year, I actually was meeting with a couple friends for drinks and dinner, and made a bet basically with one of them of by January 1st, 2022, somebody basically 5 years later, somebody will create a product in space, and bring it back, and it'll have more economic value than it did when it left, and it will cover the cost basically of the mission. And this is way before starting Varda or anything.
Okay, nice.
So it's fun to sort of be able to point back to that bet in some ways of showing
bookmark this.
I've really been thinking about this sort of for quite some time.
Yeah.
And then, again, picked up the idea, once I moved over to Founders Fund, Q4 2019. Basically, at that point, a Falcon 9 rocket had launched and landed for the first time, I think 3 times, 4 times in a row. And so I basically pinged a couple of my friends from MIT that had gone off to work at SpaceX. I was like, hey, how much are wear and tear are you seeing on these rockets? Can these things get up to 20, 30, 40 times? Is reusability truly going to be a thing? And the resounding answer that I got was absolutely, these things are seeing less wear and tear than we expected. We can definitely engineer for the areas that are experiencing wear and tear and make the refurbishment cheaper, faster, more effective. And by the way, we're definitely working on Starship, and it's a serious endeavor. And so at that point I was like, okay, the economics for this really work. Not in a future time frame. No, in the next year or two, this stuff works.
And the economics here being specifically the cost to launch payload. Basically the cost per kilogram sent to space is going to drastically drop.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, if you think about space manufacturing, the fundamental input is basically just of the do it like lemonade stand style economics. The product that you bring to orbit has some amount of mass. It has some value generated while it is up in orbit. Is that value generated greater or less than the cost of basically sending it to orbit? Right. Obviously, the biggest input into that being launch costs. For sure, there's the satellite costs, everything else, but all those in some ways are predicated. The way that I like to describe it is if it costs you $5 million to send something to orbit, you're not going to send something that only costs $100K. You're going to spend $5 million because you're going to make sure that you really freaking works and is super high quality. You're going to look like an idiot if you spent $5 million to send something $100K, that is up there, and then it fails after a week or two or something like that. But all of a sudden, when launch costs are $100K, then you're incentivized to just send 50, $100K things, and whatever half of them fail, they'll burn up in the atmosphere totally fine. And so in some ways, again, launch costs predicate the cost of basically the entire supply chain. And so it felt like those economics, worked finally. The business model was really in a 1 to 2 year time frame, made sense to tackle. And so, ultimately decided, hey, let me go explore basically all of these companies that I had studied, back in the day in 2011-12, see what they're up to, and let me go do a wider, let's say open the aperture on a set of companies, given that more had started basically since then. And so I spent about basically 4 or 5 months meeting with everybody that had worked on this idea. Everything from academics that had done small experiments on the ISS, to venture-backed groups that were trying to attack this as an actual commercial business, to some folks in big biopharma that had done work up there. So they were within commercial entities, but this is more like a nights and weekends project. And after 6 months or so, ultimately came away with the conclusion that just none of these groups were tackling it quite the right way. They were all sort of too academically oriented and focused more on like developing basically like research papers, and they were productizing and commercializing and bringing something sort of to market. And partially, the reason that they all felt that way was because so many of them were so hyper-focused on basically only operating within, the confines of the International Space Station, rather than actually building something that could live outside of that. And my sort of first principle thesis, not that I'm like a phenomenal space engineer at the time, but my fundamental thesis was you just cannot scale up this business model on the International Space Station. I can't think of in human history when has there been something that has scaled a large commercial business atop a like bureaucratically run piece of infrastructure that is like very risk intolerant given the humans on board. And so everybody seemed to be afraid of that because they were like, well, one, NASA's not going to pay for anything that's not on the ISS, and two, I can get up there just fine, but how am I going to bring myself down basically once I'm done with my manufacturing? And so idea went on the shelf again, but this time it went on the shelf for a very frustrating reason, right? I put the idea on the shelf now like probably 4 or 5 times over the past decade, but this time I was like, this is frustrating. Like, this idea, I have not found anybody, like for a long time it was easy to discount it because of launch costs, right? So it didn't make sense. But this time I'm like, the fundamental discount reason is no longer there, and yet now nobody's working on it, and I have this fear that it's gonna be like 2026, and like Starship's gonna be online, all these things are gonna be working, and still nobody's gonna be doing space manufacturing the right way. And so we definitely felt a little more motivated for the problem. COVID hits, we basically decide to really clamp down on our investment pace at Founders Fund, and so I went from like having a very intense job to like basically kind of not having a job. And so for the first month of COVID, basically just like played video games for like 12 hours a day. And then at some point I was like, I can't just do this for like, the next year or 2 years, however long it takes. I have to fucking find something to do with my life and like, be a productive, investor. And so, Keith, took me out on this little retreat out in Malibu where we did this like, whatever distanced house. We went on this like, hike. And I remember very clearly on this hike, just asking like, what the hell do I do? Like, we're not really investing. I have a ton of free time. And he basically was like, look, the most strategic thing you can do is create your own proprietary deal flow. Like, you're a former founder, go start another company. And I remember just thinking, I was like, man, I did not enjoy, like, there's a reason why I'm an investor now. Like, I think I'm a much better investor than I am founder. Why would I like put myself, through that pain again? Right. But I was like, well, there's only like one idea where like I'm motivated enough, I know enough about it, I know that like nobody else is going to do it, and so it's like the perfect confluence of like factors that I think should be required for any incubation as an investor, given the massive opportunity cost. And so starting that day, basically started to take it more seriously of like, okay, if nobody else is going to do this thing right, like I'm just going to go do it myself instead.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so Founders Fund has incubated Varda, is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say if you look at it relative to like groups like Cedar Hill or like Atomic or things like that, there's much less like support infrastructure here. So I describe it as like
well, you get to keep your job.
Yes, exactly. Delian incubated it, but he got to keep his job. Is probably like the proper framing, more less so than like there's a whole infrastructure that was very helpful.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So what customers do you guys focus on right now at Varda? Because there's a whole host of things that can be manufactured in space, but strategically, what are you guys focusing on right now?
Yeah, we were more, the company originally started off with just like this fundamental thesis of, there's been a wide variety of products that have been proven out on the ISS. Let's go more deeply explore these, talk to commercial customers, and like lean into, sort of where we have the, sort of highest hit rate. So early on was very explorative. 2 things, basically happened. One, China launched a hypersonic missile that was successful summer of 2021, about 6 months after starting the company, and all of a sudden reentry capsules that reenter at hypersonic speeds and are able to test out hypersonic technology went from being like a boonies project to all of a sudden a national security priority. So one, Varda leaned much more into the defense angle, and so some of our primary, sort of early customers are groups like the Air Force, Navy, and NASA to assist them basically in utilizing our reentry capsule as a methodology or a test bed, let's say, for testing out hypersonic tech. The one-liner that I basically like to give is
Reentry Capsule as a service, a new
exactly.
Was not a new category of startup.
Yeah, that was not an interesting business model 3 years ago, but because of the China missile, it became one. Yeah. And the way that I like to describe it is sort of the one-liner is, imagine that you're Boeing trying to build 747s, but there's no wind tunnels, and so whenever you build it, you just chuck it in the air and hope that it flies, basically. It's basically how we're building hypersonic technologies today. Yeah. Varda is basically that wind tunnel where rather than just chucking it out in the air, you can test out all the subsystems, see how it actually reacts in the environment, and then once it's all ready to go, then actually go fly the damn thing. So that was a sort of initial let's say set of customers, and then the other area where as we were more explorative in materials, clearly by far saw the most resonance basically in pharmaceuticals, and so our commercial business is entirely focused on, call it like mid cap, let's say, and large cap, basically, biopharma, is all sort of publicly traded, and effectively utilizing microgravity as a way to help them solve formulation problems. And so you can think of that as effectively like the fundamental crystal structure of the drug, and that having a huge effect, not on like, it doesn't have a structural effect in terms of like, hey, it helps attack this tumor cell or anything like that, but it can really fundamentally affect basically like the delivery of the drug, the shelf stability, the viability of the drug, effectively in terms of being able to pass certain like solubility barriers, call it like the blood-brain barrier, basically being able to affect like performance characteristics that most people underappreciate when you're bringing a drug to market, that being actually like one of the most critical things in a lot of drugs dying on the vine. Even if they know that it actually attacks the tumor cell, they just never end up finding a way to actually consistently deliver it to the tumor cell in a way that is like non-toxic and easy for the patient to actually take every single day. And so we basically like effectively partner with top 20 biopharma, and in some ways unlike the simplicity of the lemonade stand style economics that I was trying to describe earlier of like value generated in space, this is how much it costs. Obviously, drug formulation is a little bit more complex in that the economics are specific on a drug-by-drug basis. Right. So you kind of have to reanalyze for each individual, sort of drug candidate. Is space basically appropriate? So definitely more, complex, sort of business model, but partially because of having the sort of hypersonic business line that allowed us to actually scale the company to the extent where we could tackle that type of more complex business model. And this business model having been proven out by companies like Ginkgo Bioworks, AbCellera, Halozyme, publicly, all publicly traded. And so we're not the first to try to take this model. It just happens to be that our technology is microgravity rather than like synthetic biology or an enzyme technology.
Yeah. On that note, I just had a question. When the reentry capsule comes in hypersonic speeds, it's Mach 20 or Mach 25.
Yeah.
Does that have an effect on the drug that you just mixed in microgravity? Like, are there any effects there that you have to then account for? That if you're building here on Earth, you're not going to run your mix through a hypersonic Mach 25 reentry sector.
The first problem that you're really solving for is basically like thermal control. That one is like relatively solved. Right. So actually, literally, 18 hours ago, NASA landed a small reentry capsule in the Utah desert with an asteroid sample that has been traveling for about 2.5 years, called the OSIRIS-REx mission. They have a sort of similar problem in that they want the asteroid sample inside basically to not be melted during reentry, so they can study it. Controlling the thermal environment inside of a reentry capsule is definitely a solved problem. Obviously, in the Apollo days, we had to not have the astronauts melt, and a small reentry capsule basically sort of same thing. So the first problem, thermal control, relatively solvable. The second one is more around like G-forces and shock. Right. So that one is harder to sort of solve in that you are literally decelerating through the atmosphere, and so you need G-forces in order to decelerate because it's literally acceleration. So in the early days, Varda primarily focuses on small molecule pharmaceuticals, partially because those drugs are far more stable, even at very intense sort of G-forces and shock regimes. But as you start to work into larger molecules, or eventually things that start to approach not quite cells but look closer to cells, those start to become more sensitive to G-forces and shocks, similar to how a human is. You and I would pass away if we tried to re-enter and rip 10 Gs for 3.5 minutes on end. A small molecule that looks effectively like table salt, that thing can rip 100 Gs for 10 years, comes out on the other side, and it still basically looks like table salt. And so it's right now, let's say the current version of the reentry capsule definitely has limitations on the drugs that we can go after. And so over time, we will start to have to create call it V2 of the reentry vehicle that more precisely controls G-forces and shock. So that you can actually start to take on sort of more complex drug targets. That type of vehicle likely looks sort of like a mini space shuttle or a mini X-37B. Again, no humans on board, fully autonomously controlled, but it is able to actually have active aerodynamic control surfaces. Versus our current reentry capsule, it's basically like it's a brick basically. It just like comes into the atmosphere. It does not glide or anything like that. It doesn't use the Apollo era capsules. Use the trick of basically like a slightly offset center of gravity, and so they'd basically like rotate the capsule, and they would actually use that as a lifting versus a non-lifting basically force. So even though the Apollo capsule does not look like it's got wings or anything, it actually kind of does effectively sort of have a wing. Then obviously the space shuttle like literally obviously looks like a plane. So one day we'll have to work on that in order to eventually expand into a larger set of molecules that we work on.
Okay, cool. And so broadly, if we go one step up, and you write a lot about this on Twitter, Varda itself, Founders Fund, is you're interested in building in the real world, like tackling reality as it is. And there's a lot of, companies, especially coming out of the 2010s, that take advantage of insane, venture capital markets, zero interest rates, that are building or their culture is not grounded in reality. So how do you think about, as you're building in the world of atoms, in the real world, what kind of companies are you guys interested in building? What kind of founders are you looking for? Like, what kind of people are you interested in collaborating with, especially in a world that's more and more, it seems like, disconnected from reality in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think of my job, especially so as an investor, but then, even as a founder, you're ultimately aiming for long-tail outcomes, right? Like, the only way that you make, generational returns and build a generational company is to, aim for that. And, if you look at, call it the top, 10 companies currently publicly traded on the NASDAQ that are tech companies, a much larger proportion of those deal with like software plus hardware than the average proportion of a Silicon Valley investor, right? Apple, Tesla, and Nvidia are all pretty phenomenal companies. Those are definitely not, software-only companies. Yeah. And then, Amazon and Microsoft for sure obviously started off, sort of more, let's say software more focused. But even then, Amazon very early on obviously had, real-world, logistics, and even Microsoft at this point, Azure being, let's say, like a significant portion of their revenue. Azure is obviously very much so, a hardware, problem in addition, to software. And so, I think, when I think about it as an investor in terms of the types of companies that I'm looking for, I almost, not only, but, if you look at my portfolio, it's probably 85% basically like combination software plus hardware innovating in the real world. I do sometimes do things that, look closer to pure software, but they will be in, let's say, special circumstances where I just have like a personal connection with the founder or something like that, but not something that I'm like, let's say, default, looking for. And then obviously, sort of Varda obviously fits in that same category. I just think, despite the fact that like, professionally I am trained as a software engineer that writes, code all day, even since my earliest days of software engineering, it was always software that was interacting with the real world, right? In the early days of like robotics in high school, it was software that was literally moving, sort of a robot around. The goal one day was to become a software engineer that was focused on deep space robotic missions. Again, it was software, interacting in the real world. Square was probably the most, pure software in some ways that I did at my first company, Nightingale. Those are definitely pure software, and I quickly learned that it's just like not a problem set that I personally am deeply interested and motivated by. And now I'm speaking purely for myself, right? Founders Fund, qua Founders Fund, we have everything from like Joey investing in blockchain that is obviously almost entirely or almost certainly 100% pure software, or Sam Blond, former CRO of Brax, VP of Sales at Zenefits, obviously his background also in pure sort of pure software. So definitely have a diverse set of interests across the team, but at least for myself, I prefer to jump off that balcony than have to spend all day just working on software.
Right, because you've invested in like real estate related companies, in pharma, in like traditional tech, like
sleep hardware.
Yeah, I think you're one of the biggest, or used to be one of the biggest. The people on my timeline that would post the most about 8 Sleep. Yeah, it was you. I was this close to buying 8 Sleep.
Just through the tweet
I was
power.
like, my wife was like, "Hey, why wouldn't pay my mattress for you guys?" Like, there's this one I know about it because of Delian.
Yeah. But by the way, the reason I don't post about it anymore, not that I don't still love my 8 Sleep, it's just that the company's at $100 million in revenue, and so it doesn't matter when I don't tweet it anymore. Yeah. In the early days, it did matter. Like I was helping drum up interest for customers and investors.
Yeah.
So are you coming to those from like a macro thesis, like when you're sourcing investments, or are you just more organically, like how do you think about like I need to go develop deal flow or like target new investments? What does that process look like for you?
I definitely today don't have the time to be thematic, given that like I need to be building my company, like not like sitting around reading like market maps. Right. And then generally I just don't believe in that type of investing. I'm not saying it's not possible to be successful. There are plenty of obviously very successful thematic investors. It's just not my style. I'm a very founder-driven investor, and so ultimately, the assessment that I'm making is just, is this founder's vision that they're presenting extremely compelling, and is it something that can become sort of top 10, 20 company in the world? There are obviously sectors and industries that I'm more comfortable in and can underwrite more quickly than others, and so I'll have a predisposition to investing in aerospace, investing in robotics, investing in industrial logistics and things like that. Yeah. But I can't claim that I come to the world with like a hey, I have this thesis that like XYZ thing needs to exist in the world. Let me go survey the landscape. And I'm not saying it's never happened. Obviously, like Varda in some ways is an outcome of that. But I'd say like 90% of my investing is more the like am I compelled by the vision of this founder. founder. And typically I'm obviously not that compelled by pure software visions, but sometimes, as a classic example, Lula here in Miami is a example of a very successful pure software investment that I made. And partially there, it was just like the epitome of what I was looking for in Miami, of like Cuban immigrants that wanted to build their company here, even though everybody in Silicon Valley, told them that they were complete idiots. They're complete, sort of underdog. Everybody thought, what is this like, sort of API for insurance, et cetera. But it was just something that like I just really believed in the founders in some ways and wanted to be involved, in their journey. And lo and behold, 2 years since that Series A, they're like north of 40 million ARR, closed their Series B at a significant up round, et cetera. So sort of off into the races. And so it's like if you had told me, are you gonna have a thesis on InsurTech? No, like by default I'd be like, that's the most boring thing in the world. But do I have a thesis in backing like 2 Cuban immigrants with a chip on their shoulder? Like hell yeah.
Nice. Speaking of Miami, you were kind of instrumental in literally all of us being here, right? So I mean, you because you tweeted, "Hear me out, guys. What if we move Silicon Valley to Miami?" And then that kicked off Francis Suarez, quote tweeting and then being like, "Let's." The migration. So how do you see? And this is connected to another question I have. Maybe you can tie them both together. Like, part of how I think of you and founders in general is one of the best firms and venture firms in the world, but also in some ways contrarian to the traditional ethos of like Silicon Valley, and in many ways a lot of super aligned with us and what we're trying to build and how we invest too. And a lot of founders appreciate this. No DI, like you have to be in office, like no nonsense and disconnection from reality. Like we're here to build, make money. We're here to invest. Where a lot of firms, we're still tied to San Francisco in almost this disconnected from reality ways, and building companies in ways that were kind of counterproductive. So talking about moving to Miami and also being contrarian in the broader Silicon Valley ethos, how do you think about yourself in that space and founders in that way?
Yeah, I mean, for me, moving here was somewhat of a no-brainer decision in that I'm an Eastern European, pro-immigrant, pro-capitalism, pro-growth, pro-tech, founder that loves to build. And Miami is the epitome of all of those values, right? You can probably see behind me the shit ton of cranes that are in the landscape. Everybody here is like extremely pro-capitalism, anti-socialism, very much so unlike sort of San Francisco and a lot of the sort of woke libtards of California, effectively. And so to me, it just felt like, when I came here, I just felt so at home. And, in some ways, Keith moving here first sort of opened the Overton window to the idea that like you could be a professional, highly ambitious, and also live in Miami. Those were not, just sort of discoherent things. And I think, reflecting on, let's say, call it, we're almost like 3 years to the date since the original sort of Founders Fund announcement of basically like, opening an office here. I think the bet has played out, quite well. Is San Francisco like going to suddenly disappear tomorrow? No. To be clear, it does seem like there are parts of San Francisco, the energy, the maybe takeover of local politics by people like Gary Tan seem to be pointing towards a positive direction. So I'm not claiming that like Miami is going to somehow like supplant San Francisco as like the number one tech ecosystem in the next like 3 or 4 years. No. But does it have the opportunity to present an alternative vision for the future relative to San Francisco and show that vision can make it into a call it top 3 tech hub? I think so, absolutely, over the course of the next decade, right? I think right now, if you look at it in the United States, there's really only 3 particularly interesting tech hubs. It's basically like San Francisco for all things AI, enterprise SaaS, et cetera, and a few other areas. Los Angeles for all things like consumer social, CPG, and then like deep tech, aerospace, industrial, et cetera. And then New York for all things like fintech, insurtech, healthcare tech, et cetera. I think they are really strong in that. After those top 3, it really is a huge drop off once you start looking at things like Austin and Miami, et cetera. We're like nowhere close to any of those top 3 ecosystems. But when I look at basically outside of those top 3, I think which potential, which tech hub has the most potential to potentially supplant LA or New York or something like that, and becoming ahead of them. I think Miami is really by far the best shot over that next decade, and I think 3 years in, pretty happy with how that bet is playing out. Has it been sort of perfectly smooth exponential growth up and to the right? No, like there's for sure some people that have moved back that have been friends of mine from Miami to San Francisco or back to New York. But at the same time, I think if you study the fundamental inputs into what's required for growing a phenomenal tech hub, it mostly just comes down to company building, investors and founders being here, and that has really dramatically grown over the past 3 years. And relative to any other tech hub that has ever really been built, phenomenally ahead, sort of for year 3, and continues to have really, sort of positive momentum. In some ways, I just look at, call it our top 3, portfolio companies here: OpenStore, Lula, Trava. All of them are basically like approaching, call it like, some of them have cleared it, or are approaching, call it like 80%, headcount, here, based in Miami, all in person together. I think it's basically 100% chance that one of those 3 companies ends up becoming like 1,000+ person company over the next 3 to 4 years, and that's what will really cement a tech hub. Because if you look at prior tech hub, it's those first handful of like unicorn mega companies that just create campuses within the city. Then they spin off the next generation of founders. It then also attracts the mega tech cap companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, etc. to start opening offices here. Spotify has an office here, and so it's definitely it's still got a long ways to go. But do I think it has the potential to be that sort of top 3 over the next decade? Absolutely. And I do think there's some world where in like again, it's not going to be in like the next decade, but in like the 20 to 30 year time frame, is there a world where Miami actually becomes the #1 tech ecosystem in the United States? I don't think it's a 0% chance. I'm not saying it's a 100% chance either, but I don't think it's 0. I think if you just continue to extrapolate these trends of like effectively socialism in California versus capitalism in Florida, there's definitely only one that I would want to bet on over the course of like the next 30-year time frame. And climate change aside, people think Miami's going to have problems. So is fucking every other sea-level city in the United States, New York, Boston, et cetera. So at least here you have these hyper wealthy people that are probably very willing to pay for whatever seawalls, et cetera, that we need, or you just like elevate the city effectively as ocean levels rise. And so I think it's a very interesting place to bet on. And so the thesis was, let's bet on it, and then if it becomes a thing, we very disproportionately will get to sort of capture the returns of this. If you look at the most interesting Miami companies, Founders Fund gets first look, and obviously the founder prefers to have us leading the round over anybody else basically in this ecosystem.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really great bet that Keith basically made. I'm happy to have hopefully helped accelerate it some amount on a professional level, and then on a personal level, just this is the place that feels like home for me. There's the closest that I can get to Bulgarian food, Bulgarian mindset, Bulgarian culture, sort of here, and I don't have to deal with I can't say the word libtard on the streets of San Francisco versus here I can.
Yeah, and increasingly seems like founders are excited about that. What you just said there at the end, like they see all these things happening, and they just want to partner with capital that can.
Yep.
That sees the world the way they see it.
And it's very self-selecting. For the people that are turned off by the idea of being pro-capitalism, please, I have no interest. My job is to be a venture capitalist, not a venture socialist.
Yeah. End of our time, but last question. So it's a dual question that we ask everybody. It's sort of the black pill and the white pill question. The black pill is like, in your space, in terms of the investing, company building, what is more challenging or harder than people realize right now? Broadly speaking, in investing or in company building?
Attracting talent. It's like the number one thing. Like I love being involved in companies. Sort of from the very early stages. If you look at all my best returns, they've all been basically where I was the first institutional check into the company. There might have been some angel investors, et cetera. But in terms of top 50 venture capital firm, we're basically the first one. And almost always, what I spend my first 6, 9 months, a year with the founder on is just how do you build that early first 10 sort of employees, because after that everything else is just off into the races. And so I think people always underappreciate the difficulty of that. If I've ever struggled in terms of mentoring a founder, it's just been convincing them no, you literally I know it sounds crazy, but you need to be a recruiter 80% of your time for the first year after you close a financing round. Yes, work on customer or product, etc. But ultimately, I really very much believe in the Vinod Khosla quote of the team you build is the company you build.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And on the other side of that, what's better than most people realize in the space you're in? Space, pun intended.
I think on the investor side of things, the thing that I do really love is just when you do have those moments of and I'm not saying they happen all the time, but when you have that moment of you can very clearly see a company's trajectory that is shifted based off of advice or mentorship or a board meeting or something you provided, those are very gratifying moments. I generally would say I don't love the job of venture capital. I actually hate probably 80% of it, but there's that sort of 20% of getting to work with a founder and really grinding in on a problem and actually seeing how you could influence the solution. That stuff makes up for the 80% that I really despise.
It feels good to win.
Yeah, exactly.
Delian, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.